Hello, everyone. My name is Reena das Nair. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg. Today, I'd like to talk about my research, which involves the analysis of food value chains and systems in South Africa. My focus has mainly been on competition issues, barriers to entry faced by small and medium-sized enterprises at different levels of food value chains, and the role of large supermarket chains in developing food supply capabilities. More recently, I've been looking into the role of technology in lowering barriers to participation for SMEs and in creating more inclusive food systems. The COVID-19 pandemic undoubtedly has significant implications on food systems in South Africa, the effects of which are still playing out. The lockdown has affected how consumers access food and has also caused supply chain disruptions. The impacts disproportionately affect low-income consumers in township, peri-urban, and rural areas. It also disproportionately affects small and medium-sized enterprises and food systems. The implications of this are far-reaching, as the exit of SMEs perpetuates high levels of concentration that already exist and reduce diversity, with consequences for food, for social inclusion, and food system resilience. In order to understand these effects a bit better, we need to first understand the state of affairs in food systems pre-COVID. And I'd like to share a few slides in this regard. So food systems in South Africa have always been very concentrated at different levels of the value chain. At the food retail level, a handful of large supermarket chains operate, mainly in the suburbs, but increasingly moving into peri-urban and rural areas through tailoring their formats to suit the demographics in those areas. So you can think about ShopRite's USave offering, or Tsekasi offering, or Pick n Pay's Boxer offering. And this is significant because moving into these areas, supermarkets become an important route to market for producers of food, such as farmers and food processors. They're often the conduits between the producer and the final consumer. So we have a situation where we have a highly concentrated grocery retail sector. Estimates are that the top 5 supermarket chains account for around 64% of the national grocery retail market. And these estimates are from the Competition Commission's Grocery Retail Market Inquiry findings, which were published in 2019. High levels of concentration have implications for market power and buyer power, and I'll come back to these terms in a minute. But we also have alternative routes to market. So you don't just get your grocery products through supermarket chains. You have alternative routes to market, such as a fringe of independent or specialist stores like your butcheries and your bakeries, independent retailers, both formal and informal, like your spaza shops. So groceries get sold through the formal supermarket chains as well as through alternative routes to market. So let's just go back for a minute to the concept of market power and buyer power. How does this affect food systems in South Africa? What does it mean? So often, given the market power and the buyer power of the large retail chains, they're able to dictate the terms and conditions by which suppliers have to adhere to. And SME food processors often struggle to access supermarket shelves because of these terms and conditions. So they may not have the capabilities to start off with to supply the formal retail supermarkets. They may not have the volumes, the quality, the other requirements. And there are also costs associated with supplying formal supermarket chains, which they may not be able to afford. So how this plays out is that the SME food processors then sell through alternative retail routes to market and through other channels, such as your school feeding schemes, through the catering industry, to restaurants, etc. So this high level of concentration is not limited to the food retail level of the value chain. At the processing level, you also have very high levels of concentration, which I'll show you in a slide in a minute. So here you have large farmers and food processors who can meet the supermarket requirements selling through the supermarket chains. And SMEs, aside from facing difficulties accessing supermarket chains, also face a range of other barriers to entry, such as access to finance, the cost of utilities, your electricity, your water, expensive inputs, etc. So the implications of this are we have a dual food system. We have the large processors and producers being able to sell through the formal supermarket chains, highly concentrated at both levels, and you have the SMEs that sell through your alternative routes to market. So in this slide, I show exactly how concentrated the processing level of the value chain is as well. If you look at the broader food and beverage category, the 10 largest enterprises account for almost 40% of all sales in that category. And these concentration levels are even higher as you look at specific value chains. Let's take, for example, dairy products. The top 10 or the 10 largest enterprises account for around 72% of all sales of dairy products in South Africa. This just highlights how concentrated the processing level is of the value chain as well. And you might ask why we need food SMEs and food systems. Well, they obviously contribute to the much needed employment, including rural employment. But there are numerous benefits, direct benefits to consumers in having a diversity of processors and retailers. You might also argue that the large players have economies of scale, which means they can produce at lower costs, and this might be passed on as lower prices. But there are a number of non-price benefits that come with having a diverse food system. At the processing level, this includes SMEs that cater to more localized markets or that serve underserved markets that the larger players don't typically serve. And it's also critical SMEs are also critical in linking to other small businesses and value chains. At the retail level, your independent retailers and spaza shops serve consumers in townships, and they provide certain levels of convenience that might not be provided by the larger chain retailers. Given their proximity to these areas, they might offer flexible offerings, smaller units that they sell, individual units that they sell to their consumers. So Sheila's spaza shop might give her consumers credit facilities that they can't access through the large supermarket chains. She may be open for longer hours, etc. And a lot of this is really built on personal relationships and networks that develop in these food systems. So we do need SMEs and food systems at the different levels of the value chain. There are a lot of benefits that may not be price benefits, but other benefits for consumers of this. So how has COVID-19 affected food systems in South Africa? The dual food system, which I've talked about pre-COVID-19, or the dichotomy that we see, is perpetuated by COVID-19. As part of collaborative research between my research center, CRED, the University of Edinburgh, and the Economic and Social Research Foundation of Tanzania, which is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, we've looked at some of the challenges that SME processors are facing even prior to COVID-19. We've done some follow-up interviews to see how they're doing post the onset of the pandemic as well. And what we find is that many of their routes to market have been disrupted. So as I said earlier, they typically don't supply through supermarket chains. Many supply through alternative routes to market, such as your independent retailers, your hospitality and restaurant business, and school feeding schemes. With industry shutdown and the closure of schools, in effect, they no longer are able to supply through these channels. They're also not easily able to switch or divert some of these sales to the formal supermarket channels because they either don't meet or they're not able to meet the requirements, or if they are, they compete head-on with some of the larger processors that supply through this channel. So it's been difficult. Their routes to market have been blocked. Certain routes to market have been blocked. From the supply chain perspective, they also have been experiencing reduced availability of certain supply into their value chain. For example, services and machinery and equipment maintenance has been difficult, and there's been reduced availability of these services, and this has contributed to increasing their costs. From the hygiene requirements, the new procurement that's needed in terms of hygiene products and your PPEs and your sanitizers has also imposed costs on SMEs. So not only have they faced blocked routes to market, but they also face supply chain disruptions. There are a range of other effects that are in some of the readings that I've provided, but perhaps I can just touch on some of the existing support measures that are out there by governments and other sources. From what we can see, a lot of these support measures are not reaching the SMEs that we've interviewed. They've noted that they are confusing and complex to access. Many medium-sized firms slip through the cracks, and commercial or bank loans that are available are still too expensive for SMEs. And what this means is that we might see many more SMEs closing down in food systems or being severely weakened. And this really just perpetuates the high levels of concentration that already exists. So how can we make food systems more inclusive in the medium to long term? In a way, COVID-19 has forced us to rethink market-shaping policies to create more resilient food systems that are more inclusive, that are more diverse, that have a good mix of SMEs, medium-sized and large-sized firms, in order to deal with situations like COVID-19. And I talk about three ways in which we can create such food systems. The first is through greater use of technology. The second is through building supply capabilities through supermarket supply development programs and finding ways in which they can incorporate more SMEs in their value chains. And the last is through supporting alternative routes to market. So can technology facilitate the participation of SMEs in food systems? And I think the answer is a very strong yes. Food tech, which is literally food technology, is quite a wide-ranging term. It refers to the application of technology to improve agriculture production, processed food production, as well as improvements along the supply chain and the distribution channel. So just an example here at the different levels, we can think of biotechnology as producing food products with desirable characteristics such as desirable tastes, colors, sort of long life attributes to certain products, etc. We can also look at technology at the production level of the value chain, such as technology in irrigation, in grading, packaging, etc. The fruit sector is quite an interesting one, and it's one in which one of which involves very sophisticated technology to produce very high quality export quality fresh fruit. And we have an advantage in the fruit sector. South Africa has quite a strong export basket of fruit products. So the fruit sector has very highly sophisticated technology, so much so that the term industrialization of freshness was coined by Professor Kramer to highlight that even in producing or growing a primary product, that level can involve significant amounts of technological sophistication. Then at the distribution or the retail level, you have digitalization developments with food e-commerce, logistics, or digitalization of logistics networks that also contributes to linking producers with end consumers. And I'd largely talk about this last point here, which is digitalization in food systems. The large players in South Africa, your large supermarket chains, already have online sales channels. And I'm pretty sure during the COVID-19 period, their online sales have increased substantially. A Nielsen study in April 2020 showed that 37% more South Africans are now shopping online. And I'm sure this proportion will increase going forward. The supermarket chains have also invested in new models of sales using online platforms such as e-vouchers, click and collect, etc. But the problem here really is that e-commerce does not serve low-income consumers in peri-urban and rural and township areas. A lot of the existing platforms are unaffordable for small and medium-sized enterprises who want to list on them. So they might have to pay commissions and membership fees, which can be up to 30%. And this is really too high for SMEs who are already making very slim margins. Yet these platforms can be extremely valuable for small players, both at the processing level and at the retail level. From a business-to-business perspective, they can be used to collate orders, to build credit profiles, and they can lower a lot of costs associated with transport and search for SMEs, both at the processing and the retail level. If they're combined with ordering systems, payment functionalities, and access to finance, these platforms can greatly help SMEs conduct their business more effectively. The platforms can also connect businesses directly with consumers, and of course, this is important given social distancing requirements during COVID-19. There are a range of other ways in which food tech can contribute to increasing participation, and some of the reading material that I've provided goes into a little bit more detail on this. So how can we promote food tech? Well, we can support food tech startups, we can scale them up, we can try and facilitate cheaper access to capital for these players or access to finance at more favorable terms. We should think about how we can develop skills training and capacity building in food tech industries. We also need to invest in the bricks and mortar stuff. We need to build warehouses to support these platforms so goods can be stored in these warehouses. And all of this requires appropriate policies and regulations. We need to create a competitive digital space that would curb concerns of market power of certain dominant platforms that might emerge out of this. And this might be, you could do this through a code of fair practice, and this kind of a code could include capping of fees on platforms. As I said, high fees on platforms prohibits SMEs from participating or signing up with these platforms. And this has been done in other countries like the Philippines and Singapore and certain states in the United States, where during the pandemic period, there has been regulation to cap the fees that these platforms can charge. We can also think about how we can facilitate payments more easily through these digital platforms. In the case of mobile money, for instance, and other small-scale payments. In South Africa at the moment, mobile money requires a banking license, and this can be a regulatory barrier to entry for players that want to get into the food tech space. The second way in which we can support or create more resilient food systems is to build the capability of SMEs through supermarket supply development programs. Now, supermarket chains are already doing this, as are some of the large agro-processors. They're investing considerably in supporting and developing the suppliers that supply them through these supply development programs. The support has been in the form of finance, preferential procurement terms and shelf space, training, technical assistance, assistance to meet minimum food safety standards, as well as providing infrastructure. And our argument here really is we need to scale these up. We need to replicate the existing supply development programs, and we need to extend them into the region where these supermarkets have a footprint. And this will go some way in building capabilities of SMEs that supply the supermarket chains. I often get asked the question, why should supermarkets invest in developing suppliers? What's in it for them? And the answer, I think, is quite simple. It's mutually beneficial to both the supermarket and the supplier in the long run. On the one hand, supermarkets are best placed to provide very valuable information to the production sector on consumer purchasing patterns, what consumers are demanding, what the trends are. And on the other hand, a more closely located supplier base can be very beneficial for the supermarket chain because it reduces logistics costs, transport costs, if you have your suppliers closer to you rather than relying on imported products, for instance. Relying on imported products also exposes the supermarket chain to exchange rate risks. And this is something that has been seen through the COVID-19 pandemic, where there have been disruptions in import and logistics chains, given closures of airports and ports and closures of otherwise the routes that have been used to import products. Last but certainly not least, the impacts of climate change is going to continuously put pressure on our food systems, and we need to diversify our food systems. We need to develop stronger local and regional value chains in order to supply supermarket chains. So this is something that benefits supermarkets in the long term as well, given the risks with climate change. And it's not to say that supermarkets have to invest in supply development on their own. Successful supplier development requires complementary support and commitment from governments, development finance institutions, and NGOs. Last but not least, supplying alternative routes to market that I've been talking about. This also requires strengthening the infrastructure for these routes to market and creating enabling regulations that serve small and medium-sized enterprises, whether they're retailers or processors. And municipalities need to come to the party in this regard. They need to create spaces, or they need to reduce the barriers to accessing certain spaces for small and independent retailers. The Competition Commission has made progress in this respect. As part of its inquiry, it recommended ceasing the practice of exclusive leases by anchor tenants, which are typically your large supermarket chains in shopping malls. This opens up the space for independent retailers to also locate in shopping malls. So that's a step, a positive step, and one in the right direction. We should also think about public procurement tools to stimulate demand from SMEs, and how public procurement can support SMEs, providing them with a consistent revenue stream. And to do this, we need to rethink about our public procurement policies and how better they can accommodate SMEs. So in conclusion, there are structural problems in the food system that existed even before COVID-19. The pandemic has perpetuated these problems, but it also presents opportunities to fast-track interventions that serve to lower the barriers to entry for SMEs and to build capabilities of independent and small and medium-sized producers and retailers. And this will help us create a more diverse and resilient food system. Thank you, and I look forward to the engagement as part of the dialogue going forward.